It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Conversations with Joan. Conversations with Joan will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life's Conversations with Joan. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. Conversations with Joan focuses on topics that are important to your life, from health and wellness to professional development to personal well-being. Change makers join me to share their insights, tips, and strategies so you can thrive and live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. Now, let's start talking. Today's guest, Suzanne Giesemann, believes that seeing from the eyes of the soul is key to a joy-filled life. Suzanne was a Navy commander and aide to the head of the U.S. military, but the death of her pregnant stepdaughter thrust her on a journey leading to a very different destination. She joins us today to talk about how we can live from the soul's perspective, where she contends the highest answers lie. Suzanne is a spiritual teacher and author who was recognized on the Watkins list of the 100 most spiritually influential living people. She's the host of the Messages of Hope podcast and author of multiple books, including The Awakened Way, Making the Shift to a Divinely Guided Life. Welcome, Suzanne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Joan. It's just always a pleasure to talk about these topics.
Well, Suzanne, I'm fascinated by your story, so I'm going to start off with the most obvious question. How did you go from being a Navy commander to a spiritual teacher and medium?
Well, unfortunately, many of us have a wake-up call as a result of tragedy, and that certainly is true in my case. When my stepdaughter, Susan, who was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, was crossing the flight line at her air base and was struck by lightning, just a bolt out of the blue. It wasn't even raining there. And the worst part was she was 6 months pregnant. So I had witnessed 9/11 up close and personal, both flying over the burning Trade Center in the last aircraft in U.S. airspace and then walking across jet engine pieces on the ground at the Pentagon hours later. And that led me to ask deep questions at the time, but I put them aside. But when Susan died, that was it. I had to find out answers about life that I hadn't found answers to up till then.
And first of all, Suzanne, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I do understand what you mean about when you go through trauma, how you have to start to ask deep questions, because that's how I started doing this work. In a period of 5 months, my 23-year marriage ended, my mom died, and my sister died, and they were my last remaining family members. And when your life gets ripped apart like that, it is a time when you say to yourself, what's really important and what am I doing with my life? So I do understand that. So when you started to ask these questions, what did you learn and what did it do in your life? How did things change for you?
Well, the biggest epiphany came at Susan's funeral when I saw her body, and I just had a knowing deep inside me that her vibrant spirit had to still survive. So I knew that the answers to the question and a connection to Susan would come if I could just sit quietly and look for her. At the time, nobody was meditating in my realm. You know, the military people that I knew and my husband, we never even talked about meditation. But I began meditating, and that's what opened me up to experiences I never expected.
Was that when you realized you had a spiritual gift, or now thinking back, were there times in your life that it may have happened, but you pushed it aside?
Oh, it opened up then, Joan. I had no idea there was a greater reality, that we could access different dimensions and beings in higher dimensions. I look back and I know that I must have been intuitive when I was the aide to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but I didn't call it that at the time. I called it just looking ahead, being on your toes. So when I started to tap into higher consciousness in many forms in meditation, it was a complete surprise to me. Never scary, always interesting, fascinating, but it took years till I actually connected with Susan.
Suzanne, what does it mean to make a shift to a soul perspective?
Well, until you quiet the busy mind, most people don't realize that we can tap into answers and guidance and insights, not to mention communicating real time with loved ones who have passed. So to have the personal experience of being more than our story is the goal of making that shift, to realize that we can withdraw our focus on the story of us and shift our attention to a greater aspect beyond the story where we can witness the drama in our lives and gain access to insights about it. That changes everything.
Do you think that this is something we can all tap into? When we think of someone who has a spiritual communication ability, we think it's some wise, special person out there, but can we all experience that type of communication?
Without any doubt, Joan. This is what I've come to discover, because I first took my husband to a medium, and when you dive into that world, people talk about people who are born mediums. So you think that that is a special gift, that you have to have been seeing spirits your whole life. And I've come to discover personally that is absolutely not true. And I've since taught thousands of people to communicate with loved ones and guides, higher beings, with evidence. That's the big key for me, Joan, having come from that rigid military background, that we can put any experiences we have to the test and validate that this is not our imagination.
So can you explain more about that? What does the evidence show?
The evidence provides information that we can't possibly know at this conscious human level, that we are accessing information beyond our, what we believe is our individuated mind. And we come to realize we're part of one shared mind, one shared consciousness. So the evidence would be things such as someone across the veil telling you an event that's about to happen, or talking about current events in the life of someone you love that you couldn't possibly know. That's what Susan did for me the first time she came through. I felt her finally, and I was sobbing, and I said, I know this is you. There's no doubt in my mind, but my husband won't believe me when I tell him that you're here. So tell me something going on in your biological mother's life that I don't know. And she told me 3 beautiful things that we later validated, and that gave us all the awareness this is real.
Suzanne, does it come down to us learning how to discern what information we're being given? Like, for example, someone may actually see a loved one, someone else may just have a knowing feeling. How do we know that we're getting communication, and how can we tell that it's not just our own mind that's delivering us these messages?
You know, Joan, that's the most common question people ask, because we don't want to be duped. We don't want to feel that we're making something up in our grief or our vulnerability. And it's two-pronged. It first comes with an emotional factor that's surprising, that's unmistakable, the heart opening, that you just know this is real and not born of fear or hope. The second is that the information or the visit or the image is novel, unexpected, not something you would normally think of. So those two elements together leave you with the impression that it doesn't matter what anybody says, this was real, this is a visit.
So you say that seeing from the eyes of the soul, that's the key to living in joy. And we're born that way. You know, we don't know any better. But what do you think happens? Is it just that life beats us down and we're no longer able to see things around us from those eyes?
I would say it's not so much being beaten down, but being drawn in by the attractions of the outer world, being convinced by the physical senses that that's the only world, that that's the only real world. In my book, The Awakened Way, I talk about the awakened way of living comes down to recognizing you're not only human. We become mesmerized by this life, just like going into a theater, and get caught up in the drama on the stage, so much so that we forget we can step out of the theater at any time. And that's what this shift to seeing with the soul's eyes is. It's realizing we can step back and observe the drama from a detached yet compassionate position and gain a whole different perspective.
Can you imagine what the world would be like if we all did this? We all see the way people speak to one another on social media or in government, or just the wars and all the fighting. It just, if we learn to step back and recognize that we're not only human, it would change everything.
Joan, I imagine that every day. And in fact, we're creating that with this Awakened Way community. Any of my gatherings are so love-filled that people who aren't used to the community, they're like, what is this energy? I'm not used to this. There's none of that group adjustment. It's just this immediate embracing by people who have learned to make that shift. And my Facebook page has so little snarky comments and people picking at each other. It's an anomaly because it's a safe space where people know that this is where we can find love and acceptance and understanding of each other from the soul's perspective. It's absolutely stunning how we've weathered the last few years of divisions with total love on my social media sites.
Well, and if you look at your life, Suzanne, I mean, you've seen things that most of us, thankfully, will never experience. And so when you go from that world and that knowledge and seeing the world from that perspective, being able to shift to what you're teaching and living, it really does demonstrate that it's possible for any of us to do.
Absolutely. And I feel it's part of a plan, Joan, that, let's give somebody a background that nobody would believe could make this transition, this 180 turn. If I told my former colleagues what I was doing now in a group setting, they would probably laugh. But one-on-one, where people don't worry what other people think, they're fascinated. They want to know more because I really believe that each of us has this inner knowing, and everybody's had some kind of experience that you just can't explain any other way. I call them NOEs, no other explanation moments.
And the problem is we write these stories about our lives and we cling to these expectations. And I think that, those stories are very difficult to rewrite. And so you actually talk about why we should stop focusing on the story we've written. Why do you think that's so important?
Because we have to reprogram the patterns that make up the story. When we take that soul's perspective, we see that we're just reliving patterns, and our body conforms to that with the neuro pathways that govern our actions. But thank goodness, bringing science into this picture with neuroplasticity, we can reprogram the patterns. Once you start to feel how it feels to live from the soul's perspective, it's very easy to commit to reprogramming your robotic ways that just aren't working anymore.
Mm-hmm. And it requires us to become mindful of the way we're living. A lot of times we don't want to look at ourselves and our reactions or the things that we're saying or doing, but once we can become mindful of our behavior, our thoughts, our emotions, then we can make the shift that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And being human and spirit, our human side is driven by this seeking pleasure, seeking reward. And once we are more mindful, one of the greatest rewards for me is a much more clear connection across the veil, as we call it, a much more clear connection when I help other people connect with their loved ones, when I connect with my own guides and my own loved ones across the veil. Every action that I take to notice when I'm not aligned with love, when I'm being very human in a negative way, everything I take to clear that out has a cumulative effect of increasing my sense of connection with everything and everyone. That's the greatest reward of all, and it's available to everyone.
And when we live in a way that doesn't acknowledge that there's something more, that there's a spiritual side to life, I think that's why so many people are walking around with this hole inside of them, this empty feeling. And that's why I love when you say that we can go from an emptiness that cannot be filled to a fullness that cannot be contained. And I think that's really something we need to shift to, because you just talk to people, or like you were saying, from years of the work you're doing, you can see this emptiness within, and we need to shift out of that. And I think it's more important than ever today.
You are so right. And I feel that most people do a really good job of hiding that emptiness. I certainly did for many years. But that's what keeps people seeking. That's what causes people to turn to destructive behaviors, to addictive behaviors. I was one of those people for many years. Food was my drug of choice. Mm-hmm. And now I have tools that I'm so grateful to share with people for dealing with those behaviors, noticing them through the mindfulness and many other practices that make life actually more interesting, more fun, and not something to be dreaded.
I lived the same way. I mean, my life was all about people pleasing. I needed everyone's approval because I wasn't secure in who I was. I didn't know that there was more to me than what was right here in front of someone. And so my life was basically performing so someone would love me. And that's why it really is important. And I know a lot of people live the same way. We want people to like us, so we keep giving and giving and giving. And in that process, you tend to lose yourself.
Amen. I know you're speaking to so many people with that one.
Okay, so you talk about soul-to-soul communication. Can you explain that to us and how we can learn to do it?
Yes, it comes down to recognizing that we are both human and a soul. A very simple definition of that is it's all one source expressing itself through all that is. So figure a spectrum of consciousness, and the human being is a very limited aspect of this consciousness, but the soul is much less constricted, not constricted by the physical form. So we expand our awareness to communicate with other beings at the same level, at the expanded state. We normally can't sense spirits around us because we're in that constricted, restricted state of awareness. But just a simple shift that we can train ourselves to access. And it doesn't mean hours of meditation. You don't even have to go into meditation to make that shift. But once you experience how it feels to be in that expanded state, it's very simple, like changing the channel with a remote control. And from that state, the sky's the limit. We can communicate with any other expanded being.
Can you share a strategy that can help us do this?
My very favorite is a technique I call the sip of the divine. I don't know if you know about military people liking acronyms, Joan, but much of my teaching comes down to this very simple way of remembering things. And in sip of the divine, SIP stands for sit in peace. And the biggest excuses I have from people why they won't meditate, which will really open up their world and bring them to that sense of fullness, is I don't have time to meditate and I can't quiet my mind. And the sip of the divine is a very simple 3-minute practice that, if done daily, will bring about the same benefits of hours of meditation. The fun thing about it is while you sit in peace for 3 minutes, it's a specific practice, you get to ask a question of higher consciousness, even if you don't believe in higher consciousness. And because you're focusing on what arises in response to that very specific question, such as, what do I need to know right now? You're training your mind to be quiet. 3 minutes a day absolutely can be transformational.
Should someone that's a newbie at it who's saying, I can't quiet my mind, I can't sit that long, is it helpful to have music or any sounds that would transport them into a deeper state of consciousness?
That's going to be unique for each person, Joan. I love to use music, but it's very important that it's not distracting. So go by how that music feels. The key is that we don't need absolute silence. We simply need to notice the mind in those 3 minutes. What arises? If it's valuable, pay attention to it. If it's the answer to your question, pay attention. If it's not, let it go. And just by observing, you're making that shift. You're becoming the observer, and you notice how the mind works, how so much of what arises in awareness is not helpful, not healing. And in those 3 minutes of training yourself to observe, you then are more mindful throughout the day. You shift to the observer's perspective more often. You start to see your story for what it is, and you don't give so much attention to those things that arise that are harmful.
The book is The Awakened Way, Making the Shift to a Divinely Guided Life. If you would like to learn more about Suzanne and her work, you can visit SuzanneGiesemann.com. Suzanne, in our final moments, what is the takeaway? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Oh, this is so huge, Joan. That we may feel broken or wounded at the human level. I challenge anybody to find a human who's not. But at the deeper level, at what we would call the soul, you are already whole and complete. It's just the most beautiful message that too many people are focusing on the brokenness when that wholeness is already right here, and making that shift to the state that is already whole and complete changes everything.
Suzanne, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
It's a pleasure. If I can help anyone else find that fullness, that's my mission.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the show informative. At Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life, we believe that knowledge is power. Take what you've learned, apply it, and live your best life now. Remember that the information provided is the opinion of our guest and should never replace the advice of a professional who knows your personal situation. If you'd like more information, visit our website, CYACYL.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on our site, listen to past shows on demand, read the digital magazine, sign up for our mailing list, and be sure to follow the show on social media. Until next time, this is Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.